Oh, yeah, recording. Good.
Hello, welcome everyone. We'll be starting in a few minutes, so we'll start right on the top of the hour. Thank you for joining us. Just a couple more minutes. Dr. Cross has muted his microphone, so you're not hearing the latest. We'll start in a few minutes here. Okay, one more minute and we'll get started. Okay, I show that it is 11 a.m. Arizona time, and I'd like to get started here. My name is Becca Clark, and I'm the student recruiter for online degree programs at Thunderbird. And just a couple of housekeeping items. Please enter your questions in the Q&A session down below if you hover. Please leave chat just for any technical issues you may have or other items. And Dr. Cross will get to those questions either at the end of the presentation or if there's time in the middle as well. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ted Cross, Clinical Assistant Professor of Leadership and the Academic Director of the Master of Applied Leadership and Management at Thunderbird. Thank you, Dr. Cross.
Thanks, Becca. It's great to be here this morning with everyone to talk a little bit about leading change. I wanted to start off with a story. About 15 years ago, when my wife and I were first married, she had this brand new little Hyundai Elantra, and it was a stick shift. It was a manual transmission, and I was hiding a secret from her, and the secret was that I didn't know how to drive a stick shift, and I was pretty embarrassed about this. And so I tried to kind of hide it for a while, and then eventually I said, "Hey, I don't know how to drive your car," and she kind of laughed at me, and then she said she would show me how to do it. And so then we started learning how to drive stick shift, and it took me a long while to learn how to drive a manual transmission, but eventually I did. But I've thought back over the years on why I was so afraid to learn how to drive a stick shift, and why was I so afraid to tell my wife, that I didn't know how to do this trivial thing. And what it really came down to is that I was afraid of trying something new, of learning something new. And at the heart of it, I was really, really afraid of change, right? Now, the reason I bring up that story is that when we want to lead people through change, we first have to understand some of their fears. In this case, my fear was learning a new skill, but it could be a fear in your organization. It could be a fear of the markets that we're going to talk about next, or it could be some sort of personal fear. So in today's world, one of the problems is that we are living in a time where everyone is worried about globalization. There's nothing that seems to strike fear into the hearts of people more than this idea of globalization. And the truth is that globalization has an image problem. Where when you hear it in the headlines, people often think about losing their jobs or things getting outsourced, economies having problems, and so we need to help as leaders, as global leaders, to first situate ourselves in a generalized fear. I believe globally that globalization is making people feel a little bit uneasy, especially about their jobs and also their identities and their wealth. So people often tie their identities to the kind of work they do, and if globalization is threatening that, it could become something that is very scary to them. So you've seen the headlines about, globalization's failing and it's not, creating prosperity worldwide like we expected over the last 20 years. I'm here to argue that first, that our fear of globalization is partly unfounded. There's no doubt that some jobs and some industries in some places have suffered due to globalization, but we overestimate the bad things about globalization and we underestimate the good things. So let's talk a little bit about overestimating the bad things about globalization. This was a recent study that was done, and they showed that only 3% of all phone calls made in the world each year are international. In other words, we're more connected than ever, yet we actually don't talk to people in different countries. We sort of stay isolated. So one fear of globalization is that it's permeating everything, it's rampant, and even though technology can make us more connected, the truth is that we actually don't behave in that way. Another interesting fact is that only 10% of all investments in the world each year are made across borders. So another concern of globalization is that one country is investing in, for example, the real estate of another country, and they're buying up all the properties, and so that's going to cause some sort of problem. But what this study is showing from the same economist as the previous quote is that only 10% of all investments in the world actually are going across borders. So there's not that many, not as much investment as we believe or we fear. Here in the U.S. during the recession, we were worried that the Canadians were coming and buying a bunch of our real estate, or the Chinese investors were coming and buying a bunch of our real estate. But the truth is, yes, they were buying large portions, but overall, in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't as much as we believed. Next, this is one of my favorite facts. Less than 10% of people's friends on Facebook live in a different country. So again, this goes back to that phone call kind of idea that we are indeed connected, but we're not really interacting with people from different places. We tend to sort of interact with people from our own hometowns and then maybe a few states away or within our own countries, but not in other countries. So here again is we're overestimating that we are, some of our worries are overestimated, that we're worried that we're so connected that it's going to take away our identities, it's going to take away some of our jobs and some of those things. And certainly that happens in some cases. But first is to remember that we're actually not as interconnected globally as we think we are. Now, we're underestimating the good things of globalization also. This is a great study where they showed in 1990 only 23% of the world's population was middle class, and today 45% are. Now, of course, these economists are slicing and dicing the data in different ways to show their point, but overall what it's showing is that globalization and interconnected free trade has increased the world's standard of living over time. That is something that we don't think about often. We might think about, the certain types of jobs that have been leaving our country or our state or our region, but we're not thinking about how overall it's helped increase the standard of living in the world. Then just to bring it local to where I'm sitting here in Phoenix, Arizona, 1 in 5 jobs in Arizona is tied to global trade. And our dean, Professor Morrison, talks a lot about the importance of free trade. And that's one of the bedrocks of Thunderbird, is this idea that if we will trade with each other as different countries, as different nations, we are less likely to get hostile with each other. So after World War II, when we were a fighter pilot training school and then became an international finance and trade business school, one of our first presidents said, "Borders frequented by trade seldom need soldiers." This idea of interdependency, that if we could depend on each other by trading, we would be less likely to go and fight with each other. And Morrison, our president, he follows it up kind of with this summary. He says the inability to adapt as fast as technology changes leaves us feeling disoriented and rudderless, and for good reason. Citizens are left wondering what has happened to their country. Employees are left worrying about their careers and future. So here again is this idea that we are worried about globalization and its churning and its changing and the things that it causes. But really, if you think about it, a large part of it isn't just globalization, it's the technological changes we're experiencing. Now, the reason I'm bringing up all this stuff about globalization is to set the stage that if we really want to help lead change in organizations, we have to begin by sort of doing a survey of the current environment. And I believe the current environment, one of the large fears is globalization and economic instability. And so if we can sort of situate ourselves in some of the realities of globalization, we can now move on to thinking about how we might actually lead change within that environment as global leaders. And what I'm really getting at is that the core problem is that human beings are resistant to change, and nothing, in my opinion, symbolizes change more than globalization. We all know that we're kind of resistant to change as individuals, but overall in organizations and nations, we are also resistant to change. So I'm going to go through two main theorists of organizational change, and then I'm going to give you some application steps of how it might actually be put into practice. So the most famous sort of change theorist is John Kotter from the Harvard Business School. And he came up with, now hear me being sarcastic, with the simple 8 steps to leading change. So just 8 simple steps to create change. And he starts off by saying you need to create a sense of urgency. Then after you create a sense of urgency for the change, you got to get a group of people together to create a guiding coalition. So that means getting a bunch of people to buy into this need to change. Then you have to communicate the vision for changing, remove obstacles, empower others to act. And then he says you got to plan for and create short-term wins, and then consolidate those wins, and then institutionalize the change. Now, this is the most famous and most widely recognized organizational change theory. But for me, 8 steps is pretty complicated. It's kind of, I don't know how to implement 8 steps. So based off of Kotter's work, there's some other theorists that I like better. Gregerson and Black, they wrote a book, It Starts With One. So if you want to check out that book, it's called It Starts With One. And they basically say, look, there's really 3 steps and 3 barriers to helping people move through change initiatives. And that is that people really fail first to see the need for change. Second, people fail to move through the change. And then third, people fail to actually finish. So instead of having 8 steps, we have 3, which I think is much more manageable, much more implementable. And we are looking at the barriers at the individual level. So Gregerson and Black are saying, the reason why their book is called It Starts With One is they're saying, look, organizational change doesn't start with doing a bunch of things system-wide. It starts by first figuring out how to change key individuals who will then propagate the change throughout the organization and sort of move forward a culture of change. But the first barrier is getting people to actually see there's a need to change at all. Many of us have probably had that experience where we felt we didn't think we needed to change, and then it took something drastic for us to realize that. So let me give you a quote from the book under the failure to see category. They say, fundamentally, we fail to see because we are blinded by the light of what we already see. Now let's unpack that for a second. So they're saying, look, we fail to see the need to change because we're blinded by the light of what we already see. In other words, we often have been doing a certain activity or a certain task or have a certain habit that has served us fairly well in the past. And if you think of it in an organizational or a business context, that could be we've been making a certain product for a long time and it's worked fairly well. There is market changes and we need to change, but we don't see that we need to change because we're blinded by the fact that we've had past success with that old product, that old habit, that old way of being. In other words, we can't see the need to change because we're blinded by the fact that everything seems to be working currently. And that may be true, but we need to change because there are things on the horizon that will really cause problems if we don't. So here's an example. This is a great example of the failure to see the need to change. A number of years ago, you guys will remember that most cell phones, and this is a picture of a new cell phone, but think back about the old cell phones that were on analog technology. And one of the biggest makers of cell phones at the time was Motorola. And everyone had a Motorola phone, and they were analog phones. And then this new company came along named Nokia, and they were going to start something called digital technology, digital networks for cell phones. And Motorola kind of said, that's nice, they can do digital, but we're going to stick with analog. Everyone loves analog, it's reliable, and we're going to keep making phones that way. Now, of course, we know the story, which is Nokia overtook Motorola, and Motorola was out of the game for a long time, at least in volume of making cell phones until recently. And that almost all of the technology and cellular phones became digital. But Motorola didn't see a need to change because they were having so much success with the analog phone and that system that they discounted the threat of Nokia's digital phone. Now, Nokia was taken over later by other like Samsung and Apple and different cell phone makers, and then different networks came along that were also digital. But the point being is that Motorola didn't see the need to change and suffered a great loss in market share because they were not willing to look ahead and take a step back and say, could this truly be a new technology we should be thinking about adopting and developing and moving forward? Now, the question is, though, how do we get, let's take that Motorola example, how do we actually get people to change? I mean, it's one thing for one person or for you yourself or a few people in the organization to see the need to change. You might see, for example, if you were Motorola, that digital technology is important and we should move towards that. But how do you actually get people to see that need? And one way is to create contrast. And I have a picture of flames here on the screen. The reason I have a picture of flames is that one metaphor for creating contrast is what I call create a burning raft or a burning boat. Oftentimes people won't change unless there is a very clear and present danger or actually reason for them to change. And so I like to use the metaphor of a burning raft. Often people won't jump ship unless the thing's on fire. And so sometimes we have to show them through our words and through demonstrations that things actually are on fire and there might be some dangers up ahead. Now, let me go back one more time and say one more thing about this, creating contrast. One example of this is that a number of years ago, HP, the folks who make the printers, they were having a problem in their manufacturing. They wanted to actually reduce costs of manufacturing their printers, and they went to the engineers and said, can we reduce the thickness of the plastic of the shells of these printers? And the engineers said, no, we need it to be that thick. And the manufacturing folks and the business side of the house said, well, it looks like we could shave off a couple of millimeters and that would save us a lot of money. And the engineer said no. Now, the manufacturing and business side of the house knew that they could structurally reduce the amount of plastic, but they were having a hard time convincing the engineers because the engineers said it wouldn't be as high of quality as they needed. So one manager took it upon himself to actually call together all the engineers and try to convince them to his position of reducing the amount of plastic needed in the thickness of the plastic in each one of these shells of these printers. And so he gathered around the whole team of engineers. He brought in one of the printers and he put it in the middle of the room, had all the engineers gather around that printer, and then he, in the middle, stood on top of the printer and gave a speech about how they needed to reduce costs. After that demonstration, where he could stand on the printer and it didn't break, it was just like a step stool, a platform for him to stand on and give his speech, the engineers bought into the idea that maybe we don't need a printer that's this strong. We just need a printer that functions well on somebody's desktop rather than somebody can stand on and use as a step stool. So this manager created contrast by actually showing the problem rather than just telling people about the problem or using numbers to justify it. Oftentimes in business, we want to try to convince people through data, and that's very important. And we'll get to that in a minute. It's very important to use data, but you need to visualize the data. And even better is if you can help create a visual demonstration that is more personal of that need for change. Now, the second step that Gregerson and Black talk about is that after we help people to see the need to change, they still often have a failure to move. We all have had this experience. We know what we should do, but we don't do it, right? We've had a confrontation of some sort of new truth in our lives, and we've decided we want to change, but then it's very hard to actually do it. And Gregerson and Black say, look, the reason why it's so hard for people to move is that the new right thing is hard and we are not good at it. So previously we said that it was hard to see the need for change because the old right thing is now the new wrong thing. So the old right thing is now the new wrong thing. Making analog phones is now, which was right, is now wrong. And so now we're having to do something new. And when you ask people to do something new, it's hard because we're not very good at doing something new. And so if you think about this and you step back as a leader in an organization, what we're really asking people to do when we're asking them to move through a change initiative is to start doing things that they're not good at, which they're not going to want to do. And then oftentimes our systems are not aligned to reward these new right behaviors. So we need to make sure that we are helping people see that it's okay if they're not good at the new right thing right away. So how do we help them? How do we help people overcome this sort of what I call organizational or personal inertia to change? And really the first thing is to translate what we want done into specific behaviors. So if we have a change vision, we need to make that into goals. We then need to make those goals into specific actions. And then the third step, which I mentioned just before, is that we must have a system that rewards the behaviors that lead to these new outcomes. So it's not enough just to inspire people to change. It's not enough to just show them that they need to change. Now we have to help them and incentivize them to do these new behaviors that they're not very good at, they're going to be timid at, and they're going to want to regress back to their old behaviors. And so we got to make sure that we're specific about what we're asking, and then we have a system in place that actually rewards those behaviors. Now, the last change implementation step is the failure to finish. So this seems fairly obvious, but it's true. Even after we see the need for change and we start moving, we start practicing those new behaviors that are often hard, we often won't fail to reach the finish line and complete a change initiative. Even a personal change, we all know this. Now, Gregerson and Black, they posit that the reason why most people fail to finish a change is because the finish line is so far away. In other words, think about the analogy of running a race and you're asked to run a new kind of race. So maybe you're really good at running distance races, and now you're been asked to run an obstacle race, and you're just getting good at some of the obstacles. And then you see that the finish line is 2 miles down the road and there's tons of more obstacles ahead. It's pretty demotivating for people. So how can we help them? How can we help ourselves and others move through this change to finish if indeed the finish line is far away? Well, Gregerson and Black have this great quote from the book. They say, proximate factors drive people's behavior significantly more than distant factors. In other words, all they're saying is we need to make reinforcement for the behaviors we want close, both in time and space. So rather than just telling people, look, you got 2 more miles of obstacles to get through, this is the metaphor, why don't we move some checkpoints along the way to help people actually feel accomplished? So even though the people haven't really helped us all the way achieve the full change that we're working on, is there a way for us to bring intermittent finish lines closer and celebrate those accomplishments rather than saying, well, you got to just keep going and working through the obstacles until you get to the very, very end. The truth is that in most organizational change initiatives and in personal change initiatives, there really isn't a finish line, an ultimate finish line. It's a continual process. And so the more that we can move checkpoints up to reinforce the behaviors that we've been asking for, the more likely people will continue to move along that change trajectory. What we're doing is we're creating a system that allows people to see that they're making progress, and because they're making progress, they will continue to move forward. Let me give you an example. I have this Toyota Prius. It's a hybrid car, and it has this little display that when I'm driving, it tells me how much battery I'm using and how much gas I'm using. And then it also tells me what gas mileage I'm getting. And that feedback has changed my driving behavior because I want to try to get more green battery than I want to have red gas, right? So it's reinforcing, it's giving me some feedback right away, and that feedback is changing my behaviors, even though that the long-term goal is to up the gas mileage. It's giving me immediate feedback to help change my behaviors towards that ultimate goal. So we need to set up systems like that inside of our organizations also to help people move through those changes. Just a few more things and I'll take some questions. So also to help people through the failure to finish, there's 2 different other aspects we need to consider. On the left-hand side of your screen is just a picture of people collaborating together. And what I wanted to get across with this image is that you do need to have that guiding coalition that Cotter talked about in his 8 steps. You need to find a group of people that you can make sure have bought in as change agents into whatever change initiative you're working on. And you might call these influencers. So all of us know who the influencers are in our organizations. And if we don't, it's a good activity to maybe make a sociogram, and you can look that up later, that helps you see where the relationships within an organization cross and who has the most influence inside of an organization. And then gather those people and win them over first to the change initiative, and then they can help disseminate that change initiative to others by influencing them. Then you need to arm these influencers with what we have on the right-hand side of your screen, data, okay? And particularly visualized data. So they need to be able, as influencers, to tell others, hey, this is why we're doing this, this is how it works, and here's the data that shows that it actually makes a difference. And here's some data that shows that if you start off in these behaviors, that you'll personally be rewarded through this new system we have, right? So it's not enough just to have them go and talk up the change initiative. They need to have actual data to back up what they're talking about, and they need to be able to show how it will personally affect each person or each group of people as they're talking with them. So let me just summarize here. Overall, we said, look, change initiatives have to start first by the leader recognizing the general environment within which the change initiative is being initiated. In this case, I'm arguing as a global leader, you need to understand that globalization is scary for many people, even though it has a net positive in the world. Many people see it as a negative, and they might overestimate the negative effects and underestimate the positive effects. Once we understand the fears of the environment that we are operating in, we then can start to move forward with our change initiative by first recognizing what it is we need to change. So we need to see, and oftentimes that does take an outside perspective, and it certainly takes some reflection for us to see things that are coming from afar. And then we need to help people move through this failure to moving them through the change initiative and helping them realize that the old right thing is now the new wrong thing, and it's okay if the new right thing isn't so easy at the beginning, and that we need to reward that. And then help people finish the change initiative by helping them make sure that they understand that the system will reward them for proximate behaviors, things that are happening now in the short term that will lead to the long-term actual change that we desire. Now, this also applies on an individual basis. This isn't just for organizations. You can apply these steps to your personal life or your personal leadership journey. It is often very important in step number one at the individual level to have a 360 evaluation from the people you work with, or the people that are in your family, or your constituents, if you will. And once they give you that 360 feedback, they might give you some different things to work on that you hadn't seen before. So that will help you to be able to see what areas you might need to change. And then you can use these other two steps after you see the needs for change to actually move yourself personally through those steps. Now, I'll stop here. We've gone for about 30 minutes now, and I want to take a few questions and see if Becca had some questions from the audience.
Yes, and as a reminder, please post your questions in the Q&A box on the bottom. We have a question from Michael in the beginning. 3% of phone calls are international. What do you think what percentage of emails are international?
That's a good question. I don't know the email number, but I do know that when you factor in Skype and other types of technology like Zoom, for example, that we're on right now, that number only goes to about 5%. So even though it might not be that it's telephones, the internet connectivity still isn't that high. It might be higher on email. I think that you're probably right. It is a little higher, but it's still not, we're not as interconnected as we think we are.
Our next question from Heba. Do you think leading change success is associated with leadership style?
So that's a great question. A lot of people would say that for a change initiative to be successful, that you must be a charismatic or an inspirational leader. And I think that's useful, especially to get people to see the need for change, because you can paint a picture with your words and through your demonstrations that there's a real need for change if you're charismatic or inspirational. But I don't think you don't have to be an inspirational leader to lead a change initiative. I actually think that transactional leaders, for example, would be very good at change initiatives because they'll set up systems. They're very good at setting up systems that will incentivize short-term behaviors that lead to the long-term behaviors of change. So I don't think it's necessarily that it's correlated to one leadership style or another. But what I do think is that it might be useful if you're the leader of the change initiative to say, who are the people that I need to lean on the most in each one of these phases? So in step one, it might be that I need to rely on someone who is charismatic. In step two, I need to rely on someone who's more transactional. And then in step three, I need to combine the two so that I have transactional systems in place, but also have someone who's still inspiring people towards the finish line.
Michael comments, your comment about creating intermediate milestones is right on. Celebrating early, small wins propels the change process.
Great comment, and that's directly out of Cotter's 8 steps. So he says, you have to have small wins along the way because the small wins help organizational momentum keep going. So all of us have pushed a car that was stuck on the road, and at the beginning it's very hard to push because you have to overcome inertia. So human beings and organizations are the same. If we can get it going, it's a lot easier to keep it going. And oftentimes if we can get those early wins by showing people, look, we actually got the car moving, then more people will join in, and then it's even easier to push that car up the hill.
Nadine asks, does the 3% of international calls account for calls made via applications such as WhatsApp, Viper, and Skype?
Yeah, so when we add those kinds of things in, it only goes up to about 5 to 6%. So it's not a huge drastic change. So I think we're certainly more interconnected than we have been, but habitually we don't step outside of our comfort zones to interact with different cultures as much as we should, and maybe as much as we think that we do.
From Carrie Ann, when change is seemingly resulting in the loss of jobs, how do you suggest we get buy-in from the persons in the organization when fear is looming?
It's a great question, because sometimes jobs are going to be eliminated and things are going to happen. People will be fearful. And I think that the first thing to do as a leader is to recognize and be honest and transparent with which kinds of changes are coming and which ones aren't. So what often happens is some change happens in an organization. Let's say that a certain division gets outsourced and a bunch of jobs are eliminated. The next thing that happens is that all the remaining people, and even if it's in different departments, start talking with each other and worrying about if they're next to be eliminated. And what usually happens is that leaders are reticent or hesitant to not even talk about what has happened, and they won't address questions about, why they outsourced a department or why certain jobs were eliminated. And I think that in my experience, the first way to sort of tackle that is to inoculate people against their fears by being transparent and saying, look, yes, we did outsource this one department. Here are the reasons why. We're sad for X, Y, and Z, but overall it's better for the organization. And then explain where other changes might be coming so that people have some peace of mind. Now, there's still going to be some turbulence, because when there's change afoot, people often are they're a little bit weary about believing everything their leaders say. But if you can demonstrate with integrity that you're being open and honest about what changes are coming and which changes aren't, I think you're more likely to get buy-in at that point, and then reinvigorate the overall vision for moving forward. Why are we doing these changes? How is it connecting to our purpose as an organization? And how are we being transparent that what we are doing is moving us closer to that goal?
Ernestina asks, would you comment on neural behavior that impacts personal decision to make or create change?
Right. So in a couple other webinars, we've talked about the behavioral science of decision making. And there's really two systems of decision making, really of thinking. And this comes from Daniel Kahneman. And he talks about system 1 thinking, system 2 thinking. System 1 is fast thinking. System 2 is slow thinking. System 1 is really habitual thinking. And that's where most of our decisions are made, in the habits. And we use things called heuristics or mental shortcuts to make those decisions. And so what can happen is, for example, we will be making mental shortcuts to make decisions that might not be great, or they might be okay, depending. But we need to understand as change leaders that people are relying on their habits, on their habitual thinking. And so we need to think of ways to help them step outside of those habits if we're asking them to change those habits, or find ways to repackage new behaviors inside of existing habit structures. So maybe we don't change the whole process of a certain business process. We keep the same steps, but we add in new content to those steps so that it's not so painful. We might be able to keep same kinds of systems if we're going for a change. That's one thing that leaders often do, right? Is we want to change something in an organization, then pretty soon we have all new kinds of technology systems we have to use. So we're not only have to learn new behaviors, but new systems. And sometimes it's more important and more easily accepted if you keep old systems and old steps and processes, but put in new measurements and new content inside of those steps, and then lead people that way. So that's the first thing that I would think about in thinking about decision science.
From Kenan, what are key characteristics of a change leader?
I think the key characteristics of a change leader is, number one, self-awareness. So being able to see where we need to change ourselves as leaders, and then situational awareness, being able to look at a situation, step outside of it for a moment, and not be so blind to our own success within an organization, and see the threats and the directions we might need to move forward with as an organization. One great example that we always talk about in business schools is, Henry Ford said if he had listened to all the advice he got, he would have made a faster stagecoach pulled by faster horses rather than invented the Model T. Now, I think that happens to all of us. We get used to doing things one way, and we have to be able to step back and have self-awareness and situational awareness.
From Peter, how to overcome large organizational obstacles built upon failure to see via delay tactics and wait out impending trends as another flash in the pan.
Yeah. So there is a systems thinking aspect to organizational change. So one theorist that I really have subscribed to is at Columbia, and he likes to think of organizations as organisms. And so if an organization is an organism, what we have to realize is if we mess with something inside of that organism, it will have consequences in other parts of the organism. And so we need to kind of have a systems approach to that. So this goes to your question about looking at trends. And is it a flash in the pan, or is it an actual trend? And part of that is being patient as leaders to see for a minute where things are headed, because you don't want to start messing with the organism, the organization, if this is really just a fad or a flash. But if you are feeling helpless because management per se is not seeing the need for change, and you really think there is a need for change, one thing to do is to start individually to convince key stakeholders inside the organization. So you might not have the positional power to get everyone to do what you want now, but is there a way that you can start leading up by meeting with superiors and demonstrating to them through creating contrast the real need to change? So I would start there. You got to start small, and then hopefully if you can get a core group, even if you're not the boss, if you can convince a core group of the bosses that they need to change, even if they're not giving you credit, you're likely to get that change off the ground, but it can take time.
From Rami, why do people resist change, and how can it be worked gradually to ensure no resistance from the first time?
So human beings are cognitive misers. In other words, our brains suck up so much energy that biologically we're just made in a way that it's easy for us to keep doing things the way we've always done things, because it takes a lot less thinking and a lot less energy. The other problem is that when we ask people to change, we're actually not just asking them to change behaviors, we're asking them to change an aspect of their identity. We often don't realize that the way we act is often an expression of our identities. And so when we're asking them to change the way they act, we're asking them to modify their identity in some way. And that can be very scary for people. They see themselves as this kind of person, and we're now asking them to be a different kind of person. And so we need to gradually show them that it's okay. Now, how do you actually ease people into that? I believe that the strategy really is, one, you got to make things visual so they see the need for change, as we talked about. But then in number two, this failure to move stage, we really have to make it easy to change. So like I mentioned before, all of us have gone through a change initiative where some consultant came into an organization and they said X, Y, and Z needs to happen. And the bosses said, yes, X, Y, and Z needs to happen. And pretty soon, not only are we going after new goals, but there's new ways of doing things and there's new systems. So as a leader, we need to make the change easy. So we might be asking people to go after a new goal, but can we keep the systems the same? Can we keep the behaviors in general the same? For example, I've been in organizations where the change leaders said, now we're going to have different work hours for these different employees. And that was a disaster because people were habitual in their work hours. They were used to it. And they would have had better success if they just would have left the work hours alone and said, hey, it's okay, you can have your same work hours, but these are the results we're needing, and here's some ideas of how to get there.
Okay, from Olga. How do you change from driving by actions, day-to-day responsibilities, to driving by schedule, creating your own responsibilities?
So I think the question really is about how do we move from reactive, so on a day-to-day basis being reactive, and how do we become more proactive? Now those two words are sort of cliched, but the real answer is that on a day-to-day basis, there's still going to be things that we have to immediately react to. But if we can create some sort of systems and a change initiative that help us move towards the ultimate goal, we can be more proactive and be able to head off more and more of those reactive fires that pop up, right? So we always say that we need to have more fire prevention than firefighting inside of organizations. We're often putting out little fires, little emergencies all the time. But if we actually spent a larger portion of time preparing, we wouldn't have to actually be so reactive in the moment.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you guys for the questions. If you enjoyed these types of topics that we've been doing in the webinars, we encourage you to apply for our online Master of Applied Leadership and Management. It's a 30-credit master's degree. It's delivered in an online format with optional in-person experiences, and we cover topics such as personal leadership, leading change. We also talk about operations, finance, and marketing. So Becca will be available for any questions on that, but I'm glad to answer a few more questions before we end up here in about 3 minutes.
And also, please join us next month for More in Less Time, Executive Learning Skills on June 21st at 11 a.m. again, Arizona time.
Great. Any more questions?
Thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you next month.
See you soon. Thanks, everyone.